The rumor began as a whisper in diplomatic circles, then spread like wildfire across social media. Ibrahim Traore had been nominated for the Nobel Prize 2025. No announcement, no confirmation, just a quiet leak and a stunned global audience. Supporters pointed to his defiance of old power structures, his focus on sovereignty, and his refusal to play by inherited rules. Critics scoffed, but even they paused, wondering why his name wouldn't disappear. What fueled the speculation wasn't ceremony, but impact. In a short time, Traore had shifted conversations from aid to dignity, from dependency to control. Young people across Africa spoke his name with a rare mix of hope and pride, while foreign capitals watched closely, unsure whether he was a passing storm or the start of something larger. Nobel or not, the influence was undeniably, and that made some uncomfortable. As 2025 crept closer, the question lingered louder than the answer. Was the world ready to reward disruption instead of tradition? To recognize a leader not polished by approval, but sharpened by resistance? Whether the nomination was real or symbolic, one truth stood firm: Ibrahim Traore had already won something harder than a medal, a global attention, and a generation that believed change was no longer impossible. The deeper story unfolded far from press releases and prize committees. In places where Nobel conversations rarely reached. In classrooms with cracked walls, students debated Traore's speeches as if they were manifestos. In military barracks, young officers argued late into the night about duty, loyalty, and the meaning of sovereignty. In village markets, his name came up not as myth, but as reference, before him and after him, becoming a quiet way to mark time. Whether or not a nomination truly sat on a desk in Oslo mattered less than the fact that people behaved as if it did. International observers struggled to categorize what was happening. Traore did not fit the familiar arc of Nobel favorites. He did not tour global forums seeking validation, nor did he soften his language for comfort. His message was blunt, sometimes uncomfortable, rooted in history many preferred to keep abstract. He spoke of extraction, of broken promises disguised as partnerships, of a world order that demanded obedience before offering respect. To some, this sounded dangerous. To others, it sounded honest. For the first time in decades, quietly, academics began publishing papers analyzing his rise not as a political anomaly, but as a social signal. They traced patterns across the global south, leaders emerging who prioritized control over resources, dignity over dependency, and long-term sovereignty over short-term applause. Traore became a case study, his decisions dissected in seminars from Dakar to Delhi. The question was no longer is he right? But why is this resonating now? The answer often circled back to fatigue, a global exhaustion with recycled rhetoric and symbolic reforms. For many young people, especially in post-colonial societies, peace no longer meant silence, and stability no longer meant submission. Traore's appeal lay in his refusal to perform gratitude. He acknowledged alliances, but rejected tutelage. He spoke of cooperation, but insisted on equal footing. In doing so, he disrupted an emotional contract that had long governed international relations. Meanwhile, diplomats watched public sentiment with growing unease. They understood that Nobel Prizes were not just awards, they were endorsements of narratives. To even whisper Traore's name in that context suggested a shift in what the world might be willing to celebrate. Not polished transitions, but confrontations with inherited imbalance. Not neutral leadership, but leadership that chose sides so openly. Behind closed doors, conversations became tense. Some argued that recognizing such a figure would legitimize defiance. Others countered that ignoring him would only prove his point. The Nobel, after all, had always reflected its era's anxieties and aspirations. From peace activists to whistleblowers, its history was filled with controversial choices that seemed obvious only in hindsight. Traore's name hovered in that gray space, forcing institutions to confront their own boundaries. On the ground, tangible changes continued. Resource contracts were revisited. Local industries received renewed attention. Regional cooperation deepened, not through grand declarations, but through practical alignment. These were not the kinds of achievements that fit neatly into award citations, yet they altered daily realities. The absence of spectacle became its own statement. Traore governed as if history were watching, not cameras. Supporters abroad organized forums, petitions, and discussions, framing his leadership as a form of structural peace, a peace rooted not in ceasefires, but in self-determination. They argued that a nation able to stand on its own feet was less vulnerable to conflict, less susceptible to manipulation. Peace, in this framing, was not passive. It was constructed, defended, and sometimes demanded. Critics remained vocal. They warned of concentration of power, of rhetoric outpacing institutions, of the risks inherent in rapid transformation. These concerns were not dismissed outright, they became part of the larger debate Traore had ignited. Even skepticism served to amplify the conversation. Silence was no longer an option. As months passed, the Nobel question persisted like a low-frequency hum. No confirmation came, no denial either, yet the symbolism had already taken on a life of its own. For a generation raised on invisibility, the mere possibility that their struggles, voiced through an uncompromising leader, could be globally acknowledged felt transformative. Late one night, Traore was asked directly about the rumors. He paused, then answered simply that prizes do not change the weight of responsibility. His focus, he said, was on whether people could feel the difference in their lives. The remark circulated widely, quoted and reposted, interpreted as humility by some and defiance by others. Both readings coexisted comfortably. In the end, the most radical aspect of the moment was not whether Ibrahim Traore would ever be nominated, shortlisted, or awarded. It was that millions believed he could be. That belief alone marked a fracture in old assumptions about who gets to be seen as a global moral actor. Nobel or not, a line had been crossed, and once crossed, it could not be quietly redrawn. What followed was something even more subtle, yet more powerful than any official recognition, a shift in self-perception that rippled outward, crossing borders without passports or permission. In conversations that once revolved around escapee migration routes, visas, distant opportunities, a new language began to surface. People spoke instead about staying, building, reclaiming. The idea that leadership rooted in defiance and clarity could earn global respect changed how possibility itself was imagined. Across universities and think tanks, the Traore phenomenon evolved into a broader inquiry about legitimacy. For decades, legitimacy had flowed downward from established powers, conferred through approval, funding, or awards. Now scholars began asking whether legitimacy could instead rise upward from popular trust, from coherence between words and actions, from the courage to reject performative consensus. Traore's case complicated old frameworks. He was not universally liked, but he was unmistakably listened to. This attention reshaped diplomacy in quiet ways. Delegations arrived with different tones, more cautious, less patronizing. The familiar scripts aid conditionalities, rehearsed advocacy felt increasingly outdated when faced with a leader who spoke in terms of partnership or nothing at all. Traore's insistence on dignity forced a recalibration. Even those who disagreed with him found themselves responding on his terms, and that alone signaled a redistribution of narrative power. Inside his country, expectations grew heavier. Admiration, after all, is a demanding thing. Citizens who once accepted limitations now asked harder questions, about timelines, transparency, and outcomes. Traore did not discourage this. If anything, he welcomed scrutiny, understanding that symbolism without substance corrodes quickly. The Nobel speculation, he knew, had elevated not just him, but the standard by which he would be judged. The weight of that awareness shaped his decisions. Policies slowed where caution was needed, accelerated where momentum mattered. Advisors were challenged, sometimes replaced. The governing style that emerged was neither theatrical nor apologetic, it was deliberate. Mistakes were inevitable, but retreat into excuses was not. In this sense, the Nobel conversation acted as a mirror, reflecting not triumph, but responsibility magnified. Beyond national borders, other leaders watched closely. Some saw inspiration, others saw warning. If Traore's model gained traction, it could embolden similar movements elsewhere. Leaders less willing to accept inherited hierarchies, populations less patient with symbolic sovereignty. The possibility unsettled entrenched interests not because it promised chaos, but because it suggested an alternative order that did not require their permission. Media narratives continued to oscillate. One week, Traore was framed as a revolutionary icon, the next, as a destabilizing force. Yet neither extreme fully captured the reality. He was, at his core, a product of accumulated frustrations and deferred hopes. The Nobel rumor amplified that reality, turning an individual into a vessel for collective projection. Supporters saw in him a future redeemed, critics saw a precedent they could not control. In villages and cities alike, the impact remained grounded. Infrastructure projects advanced unevenly but visibly. Local industries received attention long denied. There were setbacks, logistical failures, bureaucratic inertia, but also a growing sense that problems were being confronted rather than explained away. This, more than rhetoric, sustained public belief. Awards could wait, evidence could not. International civil society groups began reframing their advocacy through the lens Traore had popularized. Language shifted from assistance to alignment, from capacity building to capacity respecting. These were small linguistic changes, but they mattered. Words, after all, shape expectations. And expectations, once altered, are difficult to reverse. As Nobel season approached, speculation peaked and then, gradually, lost its urgency. Something unexpected happened. People stopped needing the answer. The question itself had already served its purpose. It had forced a global audience to imagine a different kind of laureate, one whose claim to peace was rooted in resistance to structural harm rather than mediation within it. Whether the committee agreed became secondary. Traore himself remained outwardly unchanged. He continued to avoid grand speeches about destiny or legacy. When pressed about history, he spoke instead about continuity, about ensuring that whatever was built would outlast personalities. This refusal to center himself frustrated some admirers, but it reinforced the very principle that had drawn attention in the first place: leadership as function, not performance. In hindsight, analysts would argue that the Nobel speculation marked a turning point not because of what it confirmed, but because of what it normalized. It normalized the idea that moral authority could emerge from outside traditional corridors, that peace could be pursued through structural autonomy, that global recognition need not precede global relevance. Years later, the moment would be remembered less for headlines and more for its psychological aftershock, for the way it cracked open assumptions about who gets to matter on the world stage, for how it emboldened a generation to see leadership not as something imported, but something cultivated under pressure. Whether Ibrahim Traore ever stood on a Nobel stage became, ultimately, a footnote. The larger story was already written in changed conversations, recalibrated expectations, and a quiet but enduring refusal to shrink. The world had looked, even briefly, through a different lens and once seen, it could not entirely look away.